Thank you. We're going to turn the floor over now to Mr. Surinov. Is he here?
Дамы и господа, уважаемые коллеги, мне выпала большая честь представить замечательного экономиста, одного из ведущих специалистов в области неравенства, измерения бедности Бранко Милановича. Человек прошел большой жизненный путь, работал в разных организациях. Заочно я познакомился с ним где-то лет, наверное, 20 назад, когда читал его работы, писал диссертацию. И несколько лет назад мне посчастливилось познакомиться с ним лично на одной из конференций в Москве. Очень приятно, что Бранко Миланович является профессиональным не только экономистом, но и статистиком. Если верить его CV, когда он закончил университет в Сербии, то он как раз получил диплом специальности экономика и статистика. В этой связи, конечно, Бранко Миланович тот человек, который понимает и умеет измерять, что очень важно для такого сложного феномена, как измерение неравенства в современном мире. И его книга, связанная с глобальным неравенством, конечно, является бестселлером. И я очень рад, что несколько лет назад она была переведена в том числе и на русский язык. И в этой связи, конечно, все мы имели возможность ознакомиться с этим замечательным трудом. Он действительно бестселлер, действительно такой образец серьезного анализа. И я не буду, так сказать, отнимать много времени, потому что времени очень мало, и уже мы, скажем так, опаздываем на 6 минут, и поэтому я прошу простить меня, Бранко, это организаторы мне сказали, чтобы я вам дал 30 минут на выступление, а 10 минут, чтобы можно было вам поговорить с аудиторией. Поэтому у нас будет 10 минут для вопросов. Пожалуйста.
Спасибо. Я сколько бы хотел... Should I sit there?
Yeah, I think it's better.
Okay. Actually, I would like to stand, actually. But,
That's fine.
but the mic may not be... Только несколько слов по-русски, потому что мой русский не очень хорошо, был лучше 20 лет назад, когда я работал в Всемирном банке и работал тоже на справ России, але у меня нет так достаточно практики говорить по-русски. I'm very happy actually to be in Moscow, and I'm very happy to be invited, especially Ilya and everybody else actually who invited me. And I'm going to speak for, as we said, 30 minutes. It is a huge topic. It is part of several books. Most of them translated in Russian. The last one is called Global Inequality, Глобальное неравенство. And I will actually present today only a section of that, and there are some additional data which are not in the book. Obviously, they are being updated all the time. Now, let me say in the very beginning, there are two main themes, and they are in my also new book, which is called Capitalism Alone, which is now being published. Actually, it's coming out this week or next week. And there are two basic trends, changes that we see in this period. And you would see them actually in the data. That's actually what is the interesting part. The first one is the uniqueness of the current period in the sense that the capitalism alone is capitalism is the sole mode of production. This has never happened in the past. I mean, I don't need to go into the details, but I just want to mention that in the latter part of the 19th century, where capitalism was globalized and similar to the similar position it is now, it had to share the globe with other modes of production like feudal and slavery. Just to remind you, in Central Europe, in Austria-Hungary, forced labor existed until 1848, which is mid-19th century. As you know, in Russia, serfdom 1861. Slavery in the United States, 1865. Slavery in Brazil, 1888. So essentially, there were other modes of production. On top of that was, of course, globalist capitalism, but it was not the only mode of production. After 1917, of course, after the revolution in Russia and the spread of that revolution or a communist system in Eastern Europe and China and Vietnam and so forth, again, capitalism had to share it with other modes of production. Now, for the first time in history, it doesn't. I know that you would ask me about China. I actually have a whole section. China actually takes a big chunk of my book, but China, by all objective indicators, is a capitalist country. The second thing which is actually interesting and important is the reemergence of Asia, which what I call it in the book, rebalancing of the world, which brings the relative income levels, I look at the Eurasian continent especially, to what it was in about 1500, or certainly before the Industrial Revolution. So in other words, if you look at the world in 1500, you would have actually had, you would see that there were, of course, richer parts, starting from basically Italian city-states, then the Flanders, and then England on the Atlantic side of the Eurasian continent, and the cities which were at their equal level of income. Actually, in 1250, when Marco Polo went to Hangzhou was a higher level of income probably than Venice. And these are the parts on the Pacific coast. So what we actually will see in another 50 years is really that rebalancing of the world. That rebalancing of the world has actually many implications, including historical, geopolitical, and others. And of course, I want to mention also India, which participates in this rebalancing of the world. But it has also implications for global inequality, which I will show you in a minute here. So these are actually the changes, which are, I think, the most dramatic changes that we have in the current period. And as I said before, I hope to actually show that in the slides. If we have the time, we might actually say something about the last 25 years in the rich world. There are many other philosophical issues that derive from global inequality. You might not realize and think of that, but this is a topic that actually was not studied by economists until late 90s. Actually, nobody studied it, partly because there were no data and partly because there was no interest. And also the world was not globalized to the way that it's globalized now. But the only people who did think of this issue were political philosophers. So when I started working in the late 90s, my first paper on that is 1999, there was like zero interest among the economists. The only people who actually were interested are political philosophers. So there is actually a whole body of literature which deals with inequality from the philosophical standpoint, global inequality. So we will not have the time to mention, to speak about that today, but I just want to mention it so that if some of you are interested, this is something that actually I think worthwhile sort of looking. So let me start with a very long run. It's a very long run, and it's based obviously on the data that are worse than what we have now. But this picture here shows you, this graph shows you the estimated level of global inequality between 1820, that was around the time of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, or at least it was the time after the Napoleonic Wars. So that's where we start actually calculations. On the vertical axis, you have the Gini coefficient. As you know, it's a measure of inequality. It runs from 0 when theoretically everybody has the same income to 100 when theoretically one person has the entire income. Now look at this number. The number is 55. So that number shows you global inequality between all citizens in the world. So you actually take the world as a unit. Like when you say Gini in Russia is 38, that means you take the unit, Russia, and theoretically everybody in Russia is calculated in that. Here, theoretically, everybody in the world is calculated, included in this. You might want to ask me later about methodology, how it's obtained. It's a complicated story. Obviously, lots of that is a guesswork because from 1820, we really don't have household surveys. We don't have information. We don't have fiscal data. We don't have things that we have now. But then notice the rise of inequality from the entire century. More than a century, inequality is going up. And then in the 20th century, inequality is really at a very high plateau of the Gini, which is above 70. Now, the Gini of 70 doesn't exist in any country. Even most unequal countries like South Africa and Brazil are in the 60s. So inequality in the world is extremely high. And the first period of the rising inequality coincides with the Industrial Revolution, the rise of the West, and decline or stagnation of Asia. So if you want really to simplify the story of global inequality, you should really think of three parts of the world: China, India, and the West. And the interaction between the three parts of the world explains more than 50% in the change in global inequality. Then why do we have the decline now, which is like for the first time in the history, recorded history that we have here, is because of rise of Asia. Now, how does the rise of Asia reduce global inequality while at the same time China, India, Indonesia, Thailand, and you name it, are actually seeing rising inequality within them? You then have two forces. One force of convergence, which is the rising average level, and of course everybody practically in China, India, Indonesia, Vietnam is having rising income. So because these people started China 40 years ago with very low levels of income, that presents an equalizing force at the global level. And that equalizing force at the global level is sufficiently strong to overcome the disequalizing forces which happen within each individual country, whether it be all of those countries that I mentioned, or you add to them countries like, Russia compared to where Russia was in 1980s, or the United States, or the UK, or any other country. So these are the two forces that have to be kept in mind, and sometimes it's not easy to realize that global inequality may be going down, whereas individual inequalities in each country are going up. It is very similar to if you were to calculate inequality, for example, in this building, and you have 50 rooms. And let's suppose that in each individual room, you have rising inequality. So there are more and more people who are different. But the rooms on the bottom floor are lots of poor people, and the rooms on the top floor are lots of rich people. But the rooms on the bottom have a higher increase in incomes. So the bottom is sort of creating, as you will see in the chart, something which is now called for the first time in history, so-called global middle class. So that's why we have this equalizing trend globally and this equalizing trend locally. But it has a political implication. So you see here, I call it from Karl Marx to Franz Fanon and back to Marx. Why? Because when you break down the changes, so let me do this. When you break down what is behind these changes, and this is the graph, many of you know my, elephant graph, which showed the changes in incomes in the last 25 or 30 years. But this is, in my opinion, maybe even more dramatic graph, which is based on original work by Bourguignon and Morisson, then update by myself, and it's update with the new Magnus Madison's data, talking now about system of national accounts and the use of PPPs. So what does it show? It shows, this is like I'm breaking down that level of inequality into the between countries and within countries. So this is the between country inequality. Now go back to 1820. What do you notice? The between country inequality is very small. Why is the between country inequality very small in the 19th century? Because the differences between mean country incomes are very small. UK and the Netherlands are only 3 times as rich as China. There is not much of a difference on average in the world. Now compare that with today, when the US is 100 times richer than many African countries. So obviously the differences between the nation states have become larger. Then what you notice, the entire 19th century, the blue line, the blue bar goes up. It goes up because the countries diverge. And then large countries diverge. The West is, of course, population increases in the West. The population in Asia is very large. It doesn't grow. The differences grow and then push this blue bar up. At the same time, inequalities within countries during the Industrial Revolution go up. And that's actually quite well established. The peak of the UK inequality was in around 1860s, 1870s. Then for the readers of Marx, you might remember that the Capital was published in 1867. Already by 1980s, before Marx's death in 83, and then later Engels in 1890, they noticed one problem. The whole idea of proletarian solidarity was based on approximate equality in the material conditions of poor people in different countries. And that was true so long as the differences between the countries' incomes were small. So the poor person in England should not be much richer than the poor person in Russia or the poor person in India. By 1890, they noticed that wages in England are going up, that the poor people in England are becoming significantly richer than the poor people in the rest of the world. Actually, there was correspondence between the two of them on that, and the term was first coined of workers' aristocracy then. And this is why that when you look at this period, you have the period of empires, because European dominance over the rest of the world is absolutely astonishingly large. Actually, as Pierre Rees says, there has never been in history an economic, political, and military dominance of one part of the world over another which existed then. And that's why it was the age of empires. And it was the age of class struggles shown in the rising red portion of the line. So the rising red portion of the line is the increasing inequalities within nation states. The blue line is the increasing inequalities between nation states. Then what happens in the 20th century? This is the age of the three worlds. And at that point, the differences between nation states become so dominant that essentially your position, which is still largely the case today, is determined much more in what country you live, what you're a citizen of, than whether you're poor and rich. If you run a regression, I've done that in a different paper, about 60% of your income worldwide is determined by the place where you live, essentially by citizenship. This is what is called citizenship rent. And 20% by the parents, and 20% is really by other elements, including your own work or whatever else. So at that time, you have really inequality at the peak. And this is the time of the three world and this tripartite division of the world. The first world, the second world, which was the socialist world, and the third world, which was essentially Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Who is the representative individual then? I think it's Frantz Fanon, because he was the one who actually observed that and sort of politically sort of thought of this, because then you had really no longer conflict between workers and capitalist individual countries. You basically had a conflict between the rich world and the poor world. And that's where the non-aligned movement was created, the Bandung Conference, and all the other things which actually went with the sort of political self-organization of the third world. And where are we now? Where we are now in an entirely different world. And that's why I really want to emphasize that the new world is actually the world which is empirically different and politically different from these other two worlds. This is the age of convergence, of Asian convergence that I already mentioned. We might actually talk later about the absence of convergence in Africa, which could be a potential problem. But the current situation is Asian convergence and internal cleavages within nation states. I'm not saying internal increase in inequality because it's only part of the story. I think it's very often internal polarization within countries. This is why you have the blue bar going down, because the countries are becoming more similar in level of income, and the red bar is now going slightly up. A different way to see that is the same graphs. I will not talk about that, but it actually highlights that the change is, as you notice, there was a significant decline in within country inequalities following World War I. This is something that you see, for example, in Piketty's book, you see it in my own book, you see it in Walter Scheidel, that the decline was driven. That was a very special period. In capitalist countries, it was, of course, driven by introduction of generalized education, by trade unions, by socialist parties, high rate of taxation. In socialist countries, it was driven by nationalization of assets, quasi-disappearance of income from capital, and very egalitarian structure of wages. But then it has come to an end, as you can actually see at the very end, that red line is slightly going up, indicating overall increase in inequalities. So this is actually, I won't skip this because this is essentially what I already said, the political meaning of the decomposition. But then let me put these two other things that I said before. That on one hand, you have the decline in global inequality, and on the other hand, you have increases in within national inequalities. Now, if you asked the following question: does an individual really care about global inequality? It is a very abstract concept. You know, you might be pleased now to learn the global inequality is down, but what does it really mean to you? I will say a little bit later what I think it means. But you might have here a following exercise. You might say, let me assume that individuals are either at one extreme, cosmopolitan, so they really care about global inequality, and the other end are purely nationalistic. They just care about inequality in their own country, and they don't care what happens in the world. So then you have really the situation which is as follows. At one extreme, which is this point -6, assumes that actually we are all cosmopolitan and care only about inequality in the world. In that case, we actually should perceive decline of inequality, and this is the number 6, which should perceive the decline of almost 6 Gini points. Then we changed the parameter. It was in joint work with John Romer. We changed the parameter between the two, between our preference for cosmopolitan attitude versus national. And then gradually, the situation changes. As the national element becomes more important than cosmopolitan, we care much more about national inequality than international. So at the end point, with number 1, is we actually observe, when you look at national only, we feel only the increase of inequality. So in other words, what we did with this exercise, John and I, was essentially to say, how is it that we have something which is a positive development in the world? You know, growing middle class, first time in history, global middle class, convergence of incomes, and we have all this dissatisfaction about inequality. And we do have it because I think most people actually relate to national inequalities. And that's why, despite the fact that there is a convergence, we will actually end up in a point which is up there, which is actually perception or dissatisfaction with rising inequality, because our thinking is sort of national inequality. Now, it has, of course, another implication, which is obviously political. If you can say, if what is behind convergence is the rising incomes in Asia, which underline reduction in global inequality. But if these rising incomes in Asia lead to an increase in inequality in the United States and other advanced countries, it could then happen that individuals, if they care more about national positions than about global inequality, that these national rising inequalities outweigh, sort of on a basis of perception, outweigh the advantages of the decline in global inequality. So as you can see, we have really different conclusions depending on how we want to frame the problem. Let me then go very quickly to show you the advantages of some work with global inequality, which again, I didn't have time to say that, but in principle, for each individual year, and it cannot be done every year because there's simply not sufficient number of data, you essentially use about 100 to 150 household surveys. They are standardized. The definition of incomes are to the extent possible the same. You use PPPs to convert that into comparable international dollars, and then you calculate overall inequality. And then ideally, because of now concerned with the top 1%, you adjust for the underestimation at the very top, which is present in practically all the countries. Now, how do we let me illustrate the difference between the averages and what we do with heterogeneity contained in global inequality data. If you look of averages on resurgent Asia based on Madison's data, this is what you see if you compare China, Indonesia, and India with their GDP per capita from 1820 to today. Obviously, what you notice that actually their relative positions have gone down for 150 years, and of course there is a recent rebound, which China probably will regain its relative position in about 10 years or so. Actually, China currently, its own income, because with China saying currently is a very difficult thing to do, because when you say currently today, you mean like what happened 2 years ago, because the data are that old. But in the meantime, China has grown 10%. So then basically currently means higher than what you're saying currently. So China actually sort of currently is at the level of the lowest income European Union countries like Bulgaria and Romania, but by you know, I think under some very reasonable calculations would be at the median of the European Union by 2038. So basically 2040 would be at the median. So, and how does it work when you use heterogeneity with the same medicine data and with income distributions over the long term? So let me show you this. I think it's a very nice exercise. It's not in any book. It's something that I did recently. So this graph here shows you what is the position of the different US deciles versus the UK. UK is the numeraire in this case. So notice the following thing. If you go to this position, if I can show, is this working? I'm afraid of it. Okay, I'm afraid of highlighting because sometimes this, okay, anyway. Look at the position, which is 140. This is the position of the lowest US decile compared to the UK decile in 1870. So what you notice there, what you notice with this number here, is that poor Americans were relatively well off compared to the poor English people in 1870. Well, we know that. Actually, this is why many Europeans emigrated to the United States, because they were actually better off, even if they're poor there, than they were in England. Notice that also the people who are in the kind of upper middle class in the US also had higher incomes than the upper equivalent upper middle class in England. But the very rich people in the US did not have that. As you can see, the very top decile in the US is lower than the top decile in the UK, which again is not surprising. We know that it's based on Lindert and Williamson data. We know that the rich Americans at that time, that was just after the Civil War, were poorer than the Brits. Now, this is, go forward to 1910, just before the World War I. The same shape, but everybody in the US is now better off, simply because the US has grown faster than the UK. So you have an upward shift in the graph, but the shape is the same. This is a very powerful graph. You will see what is coming next. Very powerful graph to show you the rise of US inequality and to show you that it's not true that the US was always a country with very high inequality, as some people in the United States actually claim without even really studying the historical data. Because the shape has entirely changed. This is the current shape. The current shape has entirely changed because now the poor people and the middle class in the US are worse off than the UK, simply because the welfare state in the UK is much larger, because the support for the lower classes is higher. And as you go further toward the rich classes, they become better off and better off compared to their equivalents in the UK. So it's a very powerful graph over a long perspective to show you the changes in the relative positions. And that's where this heterogeneity comes in. So then let me just do it very quickly for China, because the same graph, same years. This is 1870. China obviously is always below 100. It's poorer than the UK, but it's again less poor for the poor people. And remember what I said before about poor people being at relatively similar levels of income in the 19th century. Why? Because the country's mean incomes, or GDP per capita, were not so much different. And of course, rich people in China being significantly poorer at only 15% of income of the rich people in the UK. Then what happened, this is the century of humiliations. What happened at the end of the century of humiliations in 1950 was that not only everybody in China was astonishingly poorer than everybody in the UK, they were now all equally poor compared to their equivalents. So essentially, they're 1/10 of their income compared to the UK. And then what happens with the China rebound? This is what happens. It's actually, then obviously everybody is now improved compared to the UK, and they have improved more the richer they are, which of course shows you the rising inequality in China, because as you know, the Gini coefficient before the reforms in 78 was very low. I mean, it's difficult even to estimate, but the numbers, I think the first surveys that we have are 82 and then 84, and they have a Gini which is under 30. And today, China's level of inequality is higher than the US level of inequality. So we are really talking about very high inequality in China. So I think, let me see if I'm, how many minutes do I still have? 3 minutes. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's really very little. So let me just show you, I will skip some things because I want to show you one interesting thing about the present. And this is since I have 3 minutes, I want to show you first the way that the global inequality looks like. This is the graph of global inequality. First of all, like all distribution functions for income, it is skewed to the right, obviously. But what is important here to realize how still low is the global median. We are talking about global median, which is only, less than $6 per capita per day. So that's the global median. Global mean is at the 73rd percentile of the global income distribution. But what's also interesting is when we talk about the rich countries median income is actually drawn here at $14,600. Essentially, the median income of the rich countries, of the OECD countries, is around the 90th percentile of the world income distribution. And this last point here actually shows you the lowest decile of the US income distribution. So that means that when we talk about global inequality, when we talk about inequality in the rich countries, and largely including, I'll show that in a minute, Russia as well, we are talking really basically about income distribution in the top 40% of the global income distribution, and even in the top 20%. Still large differences between the countries. But that will change in the last 20 or maybe 30 years with a large inflow of people whose incomes have been rising from Asia. And this will be a quite dramatic political change for the Western countries, because for the first time in the last 2 centuries, they would actually not have the entire population in the very top of the income distribution of the world. So the population of Western countries would look maybe 10-15% around the 50th percentile of the world, 10-15% around the 70th percentile. Obviously, there will be some people in the top 1% and so on. But in terms of their position in the global income distribution, they would come to resemble more Latin American countries than they do now. So this is, I think, politically an issue which the rich countries will have to deal with. And this is the emerging global middle class that I talked about. But I want to finish with the last graph. This is not going to the elephant graph. Many of you have seen it. I'm even tired of representing it. But I want to show you the positions of national global percentiles in the global income distribution. Now, this is one of the favorite graphs, is that on the horizontal axis, you have the percentile of national income distribution. So I ask you, what is your income? You tell me, I'll calculate, put you in the Russian income distribution, and they say, okay, but where are you in the global income distribution? So when I do that, and that shows in the vertical axis. So when I do that for the United States, this is what I get. Actually, even the very poorest people in the US, they are around the global median, and then obviously every additional percentile is higher and higher and higher, and 12% of richest Americans are global top 1%. That also leads you to several following political issue. Many people talk about how nasty these 1% are. But it's not clear who are the 1%, because many of those who talk about how nasty the 1% are themselves global top 1%, or global 2%, or global 3%. So, people forget that because they live in their own world and they interact with only world in New York. And of course, they see these billionaires, but this is not the only global top 1%. They themselves are all in that. Then you have Indian data, which are income data, which are actually better, I think, than the Indian NSS consumption data. So the surprising part is here that actually not that many people who are poor in India are also poor in the world. But that you have to go to about 85th percentile in the Indian income distribution to be at the minimal sort of level of income in the US. So obviously that gives, and I have hundreds of similar graphs, it gives you really, that leads you to the issue of migration. The issue of migration is simply an attempt to capture citizenship rent so that you can move from your percentile position in your country to a much higher income, even if it is the same percentile in the rich countries. Now, the next country here is China urban population. So you notice here that in the urban population in China, the median person, which is at number 50, is now at more than a 60th percentile of the global income distribution. So in other words, urban China is the median person in urban China is above the global median. And of course, you notice also that at the very top of the income distribution, both China and India are part of part of the global top 1%. Now, this is China rural. So you can see China rural and urban, and I use different PPPs for rural to actually increase the incomes of rural, are two different countries. China rural, as you can see, is between India and China urban. So this also shows you this large rural-urban gap which exists between China and India. And I then introduce here the country that actually spans the entire world, which mimics the world, which is Brazil, which has people who are at the bottom in Brazil and the bottom in the world, has significant middle class, and has, of course, significant upper middle class, and has also the top of the 1%. Interestingly, I don't have it here, but if I put China total and Brazil total, they almost match each other. So really, Brazil and China really match each other, except that for the very top, Brazil still is richer, or maybe actually we don't capture the very, very top incomes in China. And the last graph is actually one with Russia, because I wanted to finish with the same graph and introduce Russia. So as you can see, Russia is actually at the very bottom. There are people who are around the 40th percentile of the global income distribution. It dominates throughout the entire distribution, Brazil and China. And at the very top, it's actually, I think, in the few top percentiles, Brazil, which I think has more of the size of the top class is higher. It dominates Russia a little bit, but I think both Russia and Brazil have 1, 2, or 2%, depending on the year, of the population part of the global top 1%. So I think I'll finish here. There is much more to go, but I have a limited time, and I would like to thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Спасибо, Бранко. Уважаемые коллеги, сейчас есть возможность задать вопросы. Давайте мы будем только короткие вопросы задавать, потому что времени очень мало.
Можно тоже по-русски.
Можно по-русски. Пожалуйста. Я не вижу. Пожалуйста.
Well, thanks for a very interesting talk. I wondered about this fact that in your one graph, the salient lambda parameter, so how I evaluate my inequality against others and so on. Well, has this changed over time? And if yes, why has this changed? Because I'm fearing that the Asian countries are catching up and my relative position is going down? Or is there political facts behind the change in this lambda parameter? Or so just
Yeah, it's a good question. No, we don't know how it has changed. It is actually, we just assume that there is a lambda parameter and let it change. But I don't know really, has it changed? It's not an empirical parameter. It's actually sort of theoretical parameter, which looks at my position and how much I value global only or how much I value national. But your point, I understand your point, is that basically to the extent that the lambda parameter becomes only national, then we can have the situation, and I think we do have in most countries, the situation that people are really concerned about rising inequality in their own countries and don't really care about the fact that actually convergence is happening. Or even, that's another extreme, even they might dislike the fact that convergence is happening because that convergence might be taking away their jobs. So, that's quite possible too.
Спасибо. Пожалуйста, еще вопрос. Пожалуйста. Да, любой микрофон.
Actually, I'm Ratan Kumar Ghoshal from University of Calcutta. I have worked on inequality in the distribution of consumptions on the basis of the NSOC data, and there we found that gradually the interclass concentration of consumptions increases as the income class increases. So I believe that one has to consider the interclass within. That means the class composition must be disaggregated further so that one can really capture the nature of inequality in any country. And my point is this, the Gini inequality actually gives us idea about the nature of whole entire inequality. It doesn't give us any idea about the nature of changes in the classes of each classes, what is happening over period. And that is why I believe that one needs the computation of interclass concentration index. That is, I have done so on the basis of the NSSO data, where I found that as the class composition or size class of consumption distribution increases, the interclass value of interclass concentration also increases. And so I believe Gini inequality is still not a suitable measure of inequality in this case. And second point is this, that is a question. You see, one must talk about the relative inequality and absolute inequality. And what I found in case of India, the absolute inequality is relatively high, although inequality is as such a relative concept. But in China, both the relative inequality and absolute inequality are high. And why this happens? I want such.
Oh, well, there are many questions. First of all, I didn't understand fully the first point, but let me just say that, of course, it's not only the Gini measure. I mean, as you have seen, there is tail measure, and there are also growth incidence curves. And actually the elephant is a growth incidence curve, and all the graphs that I show for China and the US are growth incidence curves. So they really show the entire distribution. It's not just a Gini number. On the second question, yes, of course, the Gini that I use and tail and so on, they are relative measures. We can use also absolute measures. I don't want to go into discussion now. I think that absolute measures often, I had a discussion on Twitter, and by the way, you should also read my Twitter account and blogs. I think that they are sometimes misleading because they are essentially being driven by growth. So in other words, if you look at the US absolute inequality in the US has been rising for the last 100 years. And why has it been rising? Because simply US is becoming richer and richer country. So the absolute gaps between different percentiles are larger. So does this really help us to say that the US inequality was rising in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s? Does not, because we really, when we look at actual relative number like a Gini, we see the decline. But because US had a high growth rate then, the absolute distances have risen. So, there is a self-defeating approach in using absolute measures that it really cannot discern the changes which are due to high growth from the changes that are due to actually redistribution. But I know it is a whole topic. I am sure that I will not convince everybody, or maybe not you, that absolute measures, in my opinion, are not always, but sometimes misleading. But I agree, we should maybe use both.
Спасибо. Последний вопрос, чтобы мы были в графике. Пожалуйста. Да, пожалуйста.
I believe that if you decompose further... Okay, thank you.
Бранко, у меня все-таки вопрос. Китай. На одном из графиков вы показали, что по-моему, там середина или конец 19 века, бедные в Китае по уровню почти как в Британии.
Да.
Но вот у меня, конечно, вот эта исходная точка, как статистика, она меня, конечно, поражает, потому что вот я в 2003 году был в Китае на обсуждении итогов переписи населения 2000 года, и председатель комитета по населению Всекитайского народного собрания тогда сказал, что по их оценкам, таких прямых данных не было, но из 1,2 миллиарда китайцев в 2000 году 200 миллионов еще не знали, что такое электричество. Это 2000 год. И я себе представляю Англию, насколько могу себе ее представить, даже конец 19 века, и Китай. Вот один вопрос. Вот эти исходные цифры, это что, экспертные оценки? Что это? Что это такое?
Okay, well, first of all, obviously this is, as you said, 1870, so that's a long time ago. This is based on two sort of data. One is the estimates of GDP per capita from the newest Madison project. This is the version 2017. Which goes back for lots of countries, back to 1820. For China, the first year is 1870. I don't think there is too huge amount of the debate that China was very poor in 1870, so essentially that was the income level that was just slightly above the subsistence. Of course, the subsistence question is that whether it is 400 or is it 350 or whatever, but there is very little dispute about that number. Then the second piece of information is the distribution estimated from 1870 by Morrison for a bunch of countries, including China. Now, that's, of course, much more dubious. But the fact is that the bottom had to have an income which was around or even maybe to some extent below the subsistence. So there is, I don't think, much difference or debate about the fact that the bottom of China had subsistence. But what it shows here, the bottom in the UK also was at subsistence, not close. You know, the ratio here is 2-to-1 because it's 40%. So Chinese incomes are at 40% of the UK incomes. So UK, if China was at the subsistence at the lowest decile, the UK was 2.5 times the subsistence. That doesn't seem to me at all unreasonable. If you look at social tables, and for the UK, we of course have more data, and even social tables from the 19th century. I think it was 1867. There was a social table. Then there was I can't remember, like 1880 something, and then 1910. So we know that the bottom, but the bottom was very poor. This is actually, when you look at the social tables, they call them beggars, vagrants, people who were often impressed in the military. So they were not rich. So it doesn't seem to me that the ratio of 2-to-1, 2.5-to-1 is unrealistic.
Спасибо, Бранко. Я надеюсь, что, может быть, во время кофе-брейка кто-то сможет подойти и помучить вас вопросами.
Да. Мучите вопросами, да, можно.
Спасибо. Давайте поблагодарим Бранко.
Спасибо.